to see everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Wish we were all in person, but you know we got to take the right steps and follow the lawful orders of our governor. A quick administrative note: we'll keep this slide up for one more second as I do the introductions, but I want to encourage you to put yourselves on mute if you're not speaking, so that way we can all hear Glenn and Michael effectively. And then also do me a favor, and if you change your view to speaker view, you'll be able to see Glenn and Michael. We have so many guests on the phone today. I want to make sure that you have a chance to see them. So switch it to speaker view, and the computer will toggle directly to Glenn, Michael, and myself as we have this conversation. So, all right. So as it was mentioned in the invitation, thanks for joining us today. It's you know, always an honor to spend some time with you guys. And, you know, today is, I think, especially poignant and important that we have this conversation. And I want to first thank Michael and Glenn for taking part in it with us, for helping guide us in the development of this conversation. And I want to thank everybody else for joining us. There's a lot we can do right now, and to take the time to be on this call, to hear the stories and the information and the perspective shared is really, really important for that, first and foremost. Hopefully, if you're on this call, you get our newsletter and you saw the statement that we made from Veterans Rich Home yesterday. Hey, Liz, good to see you. I just saw your note. But I think it's really important that I reiterate a couple points. George Floyd, his murder was absolutely tragic. And you know, for a room of folks who are not you know, strangers to violence or death, it doesn't make it any more awful to see that and to know that that happens not in a combat zone, but right here in our community. But I feel, and I know the team and the board of Veterans Rich Home agree with me, in that what's more tragic is the continued violence against our Black community across this country and in Charlotte. They continue to face it, and George is unfortunately the most recent, you know, victim of that tragedy. And, you know, while we all fought and you know, respect and protect the ideals of free speech and peaceful assembly, you know, we absolutely welcome and encourage diversity of thought and perspectives and experiences, you know, but what that doesn't mean is that we condone racism in any form or fashion, especially in violence. So it's a real travesty that I have to say these things, but unfortunately the current environment and the reality that, you know, our country is in the midst of and has been living for a very long time requires us to. There's a responsibility to do it. So thank you for standing up against that violence. Thank you for standing up against racism, and thank you for being here today to support one another. So with that, I'd like to introduce our two guests. Both Michael and Glenn have interesting and somewhat similar backgrounds. If you got a chance to read their bios, you probably both saw they have significant experience in journalism, and that wasn't by accident. I'm sure it wasn't by accident on their perspective in becoming journalists, but it wasn't by accident in our invitation to them, because we felt like to initiate this conversation in our community, we needed folks who had an experienced perspective, but also an objective one. And while Glenn and Michael both have, you know, personal experiences that I hope they'll both share with us today, they also have professional experiences in covering information and the communities that we live in and how they've been shaped over several years. So I look forward to this conversation, and thank you both again. So I'm going to start first with Michael, since Glenn, Gunny, you've been a guest of our lunch several times before, so you're a bit of the hometown team. I'll introduce Michael first. Michael is the editor of the Charlotte Agenda, just recently joined that team. Prior to that, he was also the editor of Charlotte Magazine.
How do I know they can't see
They can't see you because you joined without video. So
me?
you,
No, we didn't.
Don't
yeah,
forget
you
to put
did. You'll
yourselves on
see
mute.
them, but they won't see you when you join without video.
There you go. If you join with video, you can see us, and just a reminder to put yourselves on mute so we don't, you know, we don't catch the crunching of the lunch. So Michael, after being prior to being the editor of the Charlotte Magazine, he was also the editor of Our State Magazine. He's written for The Guardian, ESPN, Garden and Gun. He's got an amazing background in writing and editing. But I think most interesting too, he
Oh,
also
I'll leave it.
read a reporter in Fayetteville, and he worked for the Fayetteville Observer. So he's very familiar with the impact of military service, of coming back from deployments with the 82nd Airborne and the Special Forces groups that are stationed there. So this is not, this community is not a stranger to him, and we welcome Michael today, and also want to congratulate him because he's a new father of roughly 3 months. So anyone on the phone is a parent, he's still in that Army mommy daddy ranger school phase. So if he looks tired, it's probably because of that. Michael, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here and to see some names I recognize in here. There's Dana Dra is in here.
Dana Dre. Yep.
Dre, I'm sorry. She helped me a couple of weeks ago with a story I was doing on some World War II veterans and VE Day, and coronavirus lockdown. So it's fun to see some names in here. I know. So thanks for having me, guys.
Of course, that was a great piece. Randy, can you drop that link in the chat? But yeah, if you need something done in this town, Dana's definitely the person to help you get it done. I think most of us would agree. Thanks, Michael. And then Glenn Proctor, sir, Gunny, I should say, 13-year Marine Corps veteran. Anyone that's been to our lunch in person has probably seen Glenn there. Glenn was one of the first folks I met when I joined then Charlotte Bridge Home. And he's been a real champion in the community for a long time. Not only was he a professor of journalism, he was a journalist himself for roughly over 40 years in different capacities. He also was the editor-in-chief of the Richmond Times. He now leads a writing boot camp here in Charlotte that one of our teammates is a part of. He's a he's trained in mental health first aid. He's a peer support specialist for veterans. And because he probably won't say it, I think I need to say it, an esteemed writer and author with 2 Pulitzer Prizes. So I won't miss an opportunity to give a Marine a hard time. Gunny, I got to say, a Marine with 2 Pulitzer Prizes, is there any other one in the world that has?
No, there is not.
I think not. So great to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. And I too, like Michael, I am so glad to see so many of my friends and colleagues, including a young lady that is part of my writing boot camp. But I want to shout out to Bo, to Dana, to Noel, to Liz, to Dr. Nicole, to Larry Gass, to Sam, to Chris Sherrill. Thank you guys for being on.
That's great. This community is a special group, and I'm glad that we're able to have this conversation, today with each other. So, and for those that are wondering, Bo Proctor and Glenn Proctor, no family relation, right?
We're cousins. We've always said we're cousins.
No, we're brothers. What are you talking about?
See, I knew Bo was going to say that.
That's great. Well, thank you both gentlemen for being with us today. A reminder to the audience, if you'd like to ask some questions, we will save some time at the end to ask some questions. I'll let you to interact, but we wanted to walk through a couple themes with Glenn and Michael. So if you have things that come up along the way, drop them in the chat. Steve and Randy will bring them to my attention, and we'll make sure that we get those answered either in the midst of the conversation as it fits, or we'll hold it to the end. So, all right. So keeping that in mind, and if you would, Michael and Glenn, I think, Glenn, yours is probably a little bit more clear, but talk a little bit about your personal connection to the military and veteran community, beyond what I just shared.
Go ahead, Mike.
Okay. Glenn's is very obvious. Mine is a little less obvious. I'm always floored when I get nervous when I talk to groups of veterans, just because of how much respect and love I have for what you guys have done. So thank you, everybody, for your service in here. A lot of that was born in me from two grandfathers who served in World War II. But in my career, one of the first assignments I had was to cover a National Guard unit getting called up to go to Afghanistan in this tiny town of Winchester, Virginia in 2003. And it was my first, field assignment. I got to go sit in during their training, I got to go with them to Fort Bragg for their training, and as they mobilized. And then I ended up moving to Fayetteville and covering the military there. So I was in Fayetteville for most of the 2000s through the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. And, I spent my 20s there, and I wasn't in the service, but I used to think, I'm spending my 20s in this town that's a town at war, basically. And so the stories I wrote there and the friends I made there were all very, very affected by it. Our neighbors were, we had so many nights when our neighbors would come home from being overseas, and we'd celebrate and things like that. So that's sort of my connection to the military. And I try to do stories on veterans whenever I can here in Charlotte, and trying to shine light on some of the things that are happening here with folks in the community here. So that's not a direct involvement with the military, but certainly have a love and appreciation for everybody here. So thank you, guys.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. It's important. Those stories need to be told. Those experiences need to be shared, and to have someone like yourself that's willing to and has done it means a lot. So thank you for that. Gunny, since I took a shot at you, you want to take a shot at the Army?
To all my Marine Corps brothers, Semper Fi.
Semper Fi.
Come on, where's that? Come on now.
I know Sam Johnson's out there.
We're in the midst of all these other branches. Come on now. We gotta scream, man. Come on, what's up with you guys? A strong
mouths are
hoorah
full
or
of
something.
crayons right now.
There we go. There's some pride.
There you go. Yeah, I did 13 years active duty and reserve. Tour in Nam as NBC specialist. Then joined the reserves, and had already started my journalism career. So I switched to public affairs and went back on active duty and was the editor of the Globe at Camp Lejeune, which all the Marines know is the base newspaper. And been really active in a lot of military affairs, not only, here, but I was on the board of the Marine Military Academy in Texas for 8 years. A couple other veterans organizations in Pennsylvania and New York. And, just love my veteran brothers and sisters, wherever they are, wherever they served, whether you served in the bush or not. I'm just honored to know you and appreciate what the hell you've done for this country.
Thanks, Glenn. Appreciate your words. Appreciate you being here today. Well, I think as we talked about it yesterday, I think it's important that we start these conversations in our community with people that we know and trust, and where we can find common ground. And as we'll discuss, I don't think there's a better group than this group, the veteran community, military connected community, to start that. So Michael and Glenn, if you could, from your perspectives, because obviously each of our own perspectives is our own and can't be and shouldn't be stereotyped across everyone else's, but how have the recent events, George Floyd's murder, the protests, and our country's response, how has that affected you? Do you mind sharing? Glenn, I'll let you go first this time.
Okay. Well, as a Black man, yes, it has bothered me, and and I wish that it wasn't so, but this is where we are, but as I'll say in my comments later, we can get beyond all of this. If all of us, believe, learn, and understand each other and converse with each other in a truthful manner, we can get past this. But yes, it bothers me, and and as a Black man, like I was telling Steve and Michael and Blake yesterday, I can get dressed in my best suit and walk into Tiffany's, and I'm going to be watched. And you guys, and many of you won't be. I can walk through my neighborhood, which is primarily white, and, people take an extra glance, even though I've been living here for 14 years. And, a lot of times it's very subtle, but, those of us who've experienced it for decades and decades understand it well.
Yeah, I think unfortunately that's the truth. It's not new. There's a new emphasis and a new focus on it, but those are things that men and communities like yourself, Glenn, have had to face, unfortunately. And thank you for sharing that. One other editorial note or admin note: if you have something to write with and have something to write on, since we all should, right? Because we all served in the military, so you got to have something to write it with and something to write on. I encourage you to and hold on to it and keep it close. And we'll get into more of that later, but I meant to mention that on the front end.
Blake, I wanted to ask Glenn something, if that's okay. Yeah.
Sure, Larry.
Hey, Larry.
Hey, Glenn. Yeah.
How you doing, man?
So I was out. I spent all my Air Force active duty time in Southern California, and after I got out, we stayed there another 5, 6. My first son was born there, and I remember vividly. I lived very close to where the whole Rodney King thing went down.
Yep.
And that was a horrible thing too. But the toughest part of that was trial afterwards, finding where they could do the trial to get to get these police officers and stuff. But I don't remember now, granted, in that one he didn't die, but does it make a difference whether they die or not? It's still terrible. What do you have to say about that?
Well, I mean, the incidents, I guess I don't pack them in one category or the other.
Yeah.
I mean, if, I get harassed or my son gets harassed or any of my friends and colleagues get harassed, I kind of put them all in the same bucket. It's just a bad situation and something that we as a country have to overcome.
Yeah, I think. Hey, Rick Thurman, you're not on mute, buddy, so we can hear you in the background. Let's see if we can help you out with that.
Hey, Randy, since you're the host, you can mute folks.
Yeah, Randy, do me a favor and help him out with that. Glenn, I appreciate you sharing that because I think it is important. From my perspective, violence is violence. Aggression is aggression.
Yep.
There are more extreme or less extreme versions, but it's all in the spectrum of not okay, and not, extremely upsetting. So I think it's the worst outcome possible that we witnessed a little over a week ago. But all of these things, and Larry brings up a good point. It goes back a long time to the Rodney King beatings and the relationship that our Black community has had with police. So, Michael, do you mind sharing some of your perspective and what how this current environment has affected you?
Yeah. So to me, this one was this movement is much bigger than it has been in the past. Obviously, we've seen support for Black Lives Matter jump dramatically, and there are stats that show this. The New York Times had a story this morning. So this has become more of a movement, and I think we should all want to seize the moment here. As a community, I thought we had seized the moment in 2016 after the Keith Lamont Scott demonstrations. And so I was down there every night during that when I was the editor of Charlotte Magazine. And it was probably the most profound week of my life. The guy, the protester, Justin Carr, passed. He was shot 15 feet from me. And so when we came out of that, there was so much work done around that, and a lot of it done by friends of mine, James Ford, with the Opportunity Task Force and things like that. There was a lot of stuff that came out of it, and one of the groups I've joined is called this group of men from across race and culture called Champions Group. And the idea is that every month, once a month, we get together and we discuss building bridges across race and culture. And the group is probably 60% African American and 30% white and Latino. And we have been discussing these issues for a long time. And some of the, I think that sometimes when you have meetings like this or discussions like this, or even go to conferences, if you just take one thing away from it, it's been useful. So if you take one thing away from this today, it's been useful. The most amazing thing I've heard in the 4 years I've been with that group, the most profound thing to me was an older gentleman named Bob, a black man in the group, told me that he taught his son when he was 16 that if he went into a convenience store and bought a pack of gum, he had to get a bag for it so that he could prove that he didn't steal it. And this is what he had to teach his son. And now I have a 3-month-old son, and I don't have to teach him that. And so to me, the question of whether it matters whether it was a killing or not is a good one. But I think it's less important than the daily interactions that Glenn was talking about, and things like that we all have to start recognizing. Are we in a store? Do we watch somebody who has Glenn's skin color closer than we watch somebody who has mine? And what does that manifest itself in other interactions we have with people, as police officers, as community members, as bosses, as people who hire people, things like that. I think it's a conversation that has to always be happening and continuing. So it's affected me a lot because it's made me reflect on the past 4 years of work that's been done in Charlotte and wonder how much, there's been a lot of money raised and a lot of money spent on programs to bridge economic inequality in Charlotte. But when I went out to the protests on Beatty's Ford Road on Friday night last week, the first night of protests in Charlotte, you could see there's a whole lot of work that needs to be done.
No, thanks for sharing that. Perspective is important, and I think similar to the point about the racial injustices that have existed for a while, the fight and the work to overcome it has been going on for a while, right? These aren't the first time that our community or other communities have stood up to say that this is not okay. But it's helpful to hear from you and with your perspective that this does feel different. Glenn, would you agree that these?
Well, I keep going back and forth. I hope so. I mean, in talking to, a lot of friends across the spectrum, fellow journalists, fellow veterans, folks that I coach and have taught, and and I think yes, but I'm kind of holding my breath because unfortunately, I've been around for a long time, and as I said in a piece that I sent to you guys yesterday, is that, I remember being discriminated, against when I was 12 years old. That was 1958, and, in a lot of ways, can we say that things changed? I mean, we had a black president, but did that really do anything? Or was that just an anomaly that just happened, and going deep within, underneath the covers, did anything really change? And that's kind of my thing. So I'm hoping yes, but I have that question mark.
I read your story, by the way, Glenn, and I hope you post it for everybody because it was really good. And there's one line in it, there are lots of lines in it, but when folks, there's a lot of folks who want calm. They want things, okay, well, let's just all get along. Let's preach like everybody coming together and things. And Glenn writes in his thing, in his essay, just what is calm and who claims to have had centuries of it? And I think it was just a really poignant line about that sort of informs why some folks want things to just go back to the way they were, and others are really fighting for change. So.
Yeah, it's a great piece. The pragmatic fanatic, right, Glenn?
Yes, it's all over Facebook and LinkedIn and Instagram and.
Yeah, we'll have Randy drop that into the chat as well. It's an incredible piece, and my favorite was at the bottom of the first page, the version we had, which was the message is simple: injustice must stop, unconscious bias must stop, American institutions must all change. We are not a country of one color, one race, one religion, or one way of life. And then my favorite part: ask the lady in the New York harbor. It's just a very tangible reminder that that's not the point. That the difference is the strength comes with strength. And you know, in our conversation yesterday, it came up, you know, what is different about this, you know, where are we right now as a country with this, tackling this, you know, and to coin your phrase, Glenn, the triple whammy, right? We had the pandemic, then some of the economic fallout from that, and now the racial tensions and unrest related to George Floyd's murder, you know, and that while those all feel like cascading effects, in reality, they kind of go backwards, right? And
Yep.
in reverse order, we've had racial injustice for 400 plus years. And therefore, the economic disparities, you know, have just exacerbated from that. And while they've been around for a while, they're especially, you know, notable now in our community, as noted in the, you know, mobility survey and task force around opportunity in Charlotte. And then when you add a pandemic onto it, it just exacerbates, right? And amplifies those challenges. So I think there's a lot to be said for the variables all coming at once. But I think the point is, and maybe the underlying opportunity is to grasp this moment, right? When we don't have sports to watch, when we don't have anywhere else to go, then maybe the pandemic is doing us a favor to really sit in this and not be distracted, right? But then how do you have that conversation, right? What's the challenge of that? And for the audience, one of the reasons we really felt comfortable and we're glad that the timing worked out with having Michael already on the schedule and then reaching out to Glenn was, who better to talk about how to listen than journalists? So, right, if the goal here is to listen and to encourage people to talk, these guys are professional listeners. So from your perspectives, you know, Michael, then Glenn, can you talk about some tools you have? So in order to have these conversations, you know, we've all heard it by now, but it's a little harder to do. What are some tips to let us and allow us to be better listeners?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, I think this is probably the most important step anybody can take, is to sort of muzzle yourself, I guess, in a conversation sometimes and just listen. Because we are primed now to, you know, everything is about responses. You know, social media is about responses. That's how Facebook made billions of dollars. But listening is, you know, it's a core trait of what we do. And I have this, when I go through the toughest, so, you know, over the past couple of years, the thing that was hardest on me was my father dying. And it took about a year. He was in hospice care for a long time. And when we had tough conversations with his doctors and chaplains and things like that, my instinct was to detach myself from the moment a little bit and start writing it down. Like I would just take notes in my phone as they were talking. So I was like becoming a reporter for my family so that we didn't forget things that the doctors said, like, oh, he needs this medicine, or something like that. And I think that that's applicable to these conversations. When you're hearing something that maybe challenges the way that you see race and culture, or, you know, when you see something that maybe is different from what you've always believed, write it down so you can remember it and think about it, rather than immediately respond to it. So I just sort of see it as like reporting on your own worldview, reporting, you know, just write it down. I think writing things down is sort of a lost art, but it is really, really important because you can write down your feelings. You can understand if that feeling was justified later. You can write, you know, or whether it was just an emotional reaction to something that you didn't really understand. So that's just a very practical tool that I use when I'm in situations. So
Yeah, it seems simple, but I think it is. It's pretty brilliant. So for those listening and watching, now you know why I said to make sure you got something to write down, because in the midst of this, it is going to be challenging, and we encourage you to take that advice from Michael. Glenn, how about yourself?
You know, kind of along the same lines. Liz, are you listening?
She's been
Liz?
at.
She's not there. But yes, that's one thing that I teach in my writing boot camps. You know, we write everything down, but even as a practical matter, you know, even around the house, you know, I tell my wife, write everything down, you know, just because that's what I'm used to doing, you know, as a journalist. But yes, in these times, writing, you know, as I teach, is very cathartic, and it could be anger, it could be profane, it could be joy, it could be hope, it could be all these things intertwined, you know, in a poem, in an essay. But once you see it on paper and get it out there, you know, you've gotten it, part of it, out of your system, out of your mind, out of your soul, out of your head. And, you know, so I totally concur. Don't be afraid to write it down. You know, whatever it is, whatever you're feeling, you're mad, you're angry, you know, you're joyful, you know, write it all down. And this time that we're having, you know, in the middle of this triple whammy, I think is a good time to practice the art of writing.
I appreciate it. And it was interesting to me to hear you two discuss this yesterday, because something I wrote down, you said, Glenn, was, you know, take a breath, right? When you're listening, when you're actively listening, take a breath. And I think the act of writing kind of forces you to do something, gives you that outlet of doing something without responding to the speaker, right? Or to the things that you're hearing. But what you also said was, don't be afraid of what you might hear.
Well, that's very true. You know, I'll take this quote from Daniel Pink, Daniel Pink is a, of course, worldwide known coach and best-selling author, you know, and he said, be less certain of your views and more intellectually humble about what you think you know and understand, you know, and I totally like that. It's like the title of my piece, be a pragmatist, listen first before you respond, you know, be thoughtful in your listening, but also be thoughtful in your response, you know, because everybody is on ready, set right now, you know, for all the known reasons. And we just have to, you know, as Blake just said, find some calm or take the temperature down.
Right. Well, and what, you know, thinking about this conversation and our veterans that are on the call, you know, I think this goes for any veteran in the community. I can speak from the infantry standpoint. You know, we are trained and taught to assess a situation, right? Take that tactical pause in a situation before we respond to it, right? We want to be responsive. Of course, the military is famously responsive to things, but it's also about gathering the information, not being, as you said, sir, certain about what we're predisposed to think is going on, but actually observe what's going on, take in that information, don't be afraid of it, and then have that, you know, wherewithal and presence to, you know, follow up and like you said, respond as needed, rather than being that reflexive sort of response, right?
Yes. You know, another thing that Daniel Pink said, you know, we're full of content, but we're starved of context. You know, and I thought that was very, very profound, because we're being, you know, content is being, you know, excuse the pun, but shot at us in all directions, whether it's online, radio, TV, our friends, newspapers, whatever. And, but do we truly understand the context of the issue? You know, and will we, as Blake said, will we take that time to do so without responding, like knuckleheads?
Mhm. Yeah, and so that listening is obviously key. And Michael, is there anything you want to add on listening that we didn't touch on?
I mean, I think, some folks I hear say, well, where do I start with that? Like, where do I start with listening? There are groups in town built around bringing people together. CMPD had a bunch of them a while ago. You could sit at a table with people and be presented with a situation and talk about, you give your reaction to that situation, and you might be surprised to know your biases. I mean, I think evaluating your biases is really important. But I would say start with your friends. It's possible, and I think it's certainly true with a lot of folks, that friends, if you have a friend who's from a different race than you, there's a good chance that maybe you've never discussed race with that person, and because you don't want to do anything to mess with the friendship. I think it's important but that also means that your friendship hasn't achieved a level of depth that it could. And so a lot of it starts just, I would say start in your circles. Start in your circles of people and really have these conversations, because you may find that if you're a white person and you have a black friend, and that you may just think everything is fine, you have no idea what's under the surface and what goes through that person's mind as he walks into a store. So, I mean, I think starting with your friends is really good, and really having deep and meaningful conversations. I think Glenn has it in his piece. There's a line there, like, our communication should be grounded in these conversations now, or something like that. I think I don't have it up, but I mean, this is where we got to go with our conversations now, because otherwise we're just sort of intentionally being ignorant about what other people have gone through.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, Glenn.
Go ahead, Blake.
No, I was just going to say, I think that's right. I think it's really important feedback to start close and find that common ground. Glenn?
Well, it's about, as, referring back to the piece again, as Michael's done several times. Thank you very much. But history, let's all know each other's history, whether it's, European immigrants or Asian immigrants, or, Africans that unfortunately came over, on a boat. So, through no volition of their own, Native people who were pushed onto reservations. That's the real history of America, and we all need to know that and take responsibility for that. No, none of us were here. None of us are here now. We're part of some of those scenarios, but that is part of cultural understanding and the listening. And, and the final point, we all have to take full ownership of our own stink. If our history stinks, or if there are situations, I'm not in favor of, the violence or, the looting and all that. In fact, that makes me crazy as hell. I kind of understand it. I don't like it, but, we have to take, whoever's responsible for that, has to take ownership for that, because that's the other side of the spectrum. And we have to look at, as Blake said, we have to look at all sides of this scenario, all sides of it, whether it's the police, whether it's history, whether it's, your neighborhood. Your neighborhoods, your city, we have to look at all those things in understanding where each person comes from. As a quick aside, we talked about transition yesterday, military transition, and how everybody's transition is not the same. Some folks have a much horrible, coming back to the world situation than others. And, that's another thing we have to look at.
Right.
45% of the homeless in America are African American. Of the homeless vets are African American and Hispanic American. And that's that's something that, well, none of us should be homeless. No veteran should be homeless, but that's a stat that I use a lot, which, really bothers me because, we're leaving veterans behind, whatever color they are. And that's bad on all of us.
Yeah, there's some real truth in that, and I think we talked about it. But we like to say that I only see green in the military, right? We're all green or blue when we're in service, right? Well, the reality is, and Michael, I think I'm stealing your thunder. We don't all come back to a world that's green or blue, right? The world is different that we transition into, and I think the data that we've served and seen as well is the same, where 11% of the veteran population is identifies as Black, and 61% of the people that we've served at Veterans Return in the last 10 years have identified as Black. So that's a disproportionate challenge. They're facing challenges at significantly disproportionate ratios. So the one thing I want to quickly touch on before we pivot a little to the veteran experience is the when we say we should listen, and I agree that's the thing, it implies that someone should share something. And I'd say I even struggle with how do we ask the right questions? What are from two reporters, two journalists, what are the right questions to ask to encourage someone to respectfully and deliberately open up so that we can then turn around and listen? So right now, and Glenn, do you want to take that one first?
Yeah. And we talked about some of the questions yesterday. How has race impacted you? Whatever gender you are, whatever, color, nationality you are, how has race impacted you? And at that point you have to be, or you should be, very, very transparent. If you got beat up by a Black kid when you're in 5th grade, you're still pissed about that. Or if I got slighted by, I got slighted when I was 12 years old in Cecil County, Maryland. Am I still pissed about that? But I have to be absolutely transparent in answering that question, whether it's, my current situation or situations that I've held on to for way too long.
Right. And acknowledging that, right? Kind of owning that. I thought a really important point that you made, and it's really one that we need to hold on to as veterans and community members. Michael, how about for you? What's a question? What would be the right question that someone could ask to start a conversation?
I like that question, and I think it's twofold. You start with yourself by asking that question. I think it's really important to ask yourself that question and consider it all the time, and especially I think right now. I think if you're a white person and you are not aware of how your race has helped you in our current system, then it's time to start asking those questions of yourself. So really thinking like, okay, was it as simple as in my first job interview, I went into the job interview and there were 3 white people there and I was just immediately more comfortable because of that situation, or things like that. I think it's important to ask yourself that question, and to ask it of others. I think it's important to know, regardless of race, what, like Glenn said, how race plays into somebody's story. In the grand scheme, we're all one big story with a start point and an end point. And how did race play into that story? Sometimes we like to think it's a minor character, but it's it's a huge character, and especially in America. So I think it's really important to ask those questions of yourselves, of your friends, and I don't know if you need to go have it in the. I have some friends, we go camping and we talk about it. Like, it helps to do that. So we go out in the woods and talk about it with, a bottle of bourbon. Just helps, Sorry.
Yeah, no. I think most, a lot of folks on the call would probably agree with you there. And I think it speaks to Glenn's earlier point about context, Well, to get the context and understand it, you got to make the time for it, right? You have to spend the time with each other and find that. And in having this conversation, what has occurred to me is that our veteran community feels so uniquely positioned to have these conversations, right? To ask these questions. Glenn, you said it yesterday. We'll run towards gunfire. We'll jump out of airplanes. We'll do all this dangerous stuff. You know, why can't we talk about race, right? Why can't we talk about gender? Why can't we talk about inequality? Since when are we afraid of things, right? And to be able to talk about those things doesn't lessen the impact, right, of veterans' experiences. You have, you know, what occurred to me is I've seen World War II veterans look at post 9/11 veterans and say, oh my gosh, I can't imagine having an enemy without a uniform, right? Or the World War II veteran, or excuse me, the post 9/11 veteran saying to a World War II veteran, I can't imagine not having Gore-Tex and being in the Battle of the Bulge, right? And it doesn't lessen your experience or your pain or your, you know, whatever your life transpired by being able to acknowledge someone else's and appreciate where that comes from. So, you know, what is it about that? And from your both perspectives, having served, having covered people that have served, what is unique about the military and veteran community that sort of allows us, and I would say charges us, to have these conversations?
Well, I mean, you know, taking, you know, us all as veterans, I mean, when we're in, you know, when we're in companies or, you know, battalions or units, you know, going all the way back to Paris Island, you know, it doesn't matter if you're a rich kid or a poor kid, you know, the drill instructor's job was to kick your ass and you know, and get you ready, you know, and train you to become, you know, become a Marine. And, you know, and that's where it started, at least, you know, I can't speak for the other services, but on the Marine Corps side, you know, whether you went to San Diego or PI or Quantico, you know, the DI's job was to, you know, get you ready. And you were one cohesive unit. And you knew, even in the bush, that, you know, your, you know, white brother, Hispanic brother, you know, Latino sister had to have your back. No, and you had theirs no matter what. So, but what happens is that even with veterans, we come out and we lose that camaraderie because we come back into the world and the world has its own problems and situations, and we get, you know, aligned with a certain situation. And that same camaraderie that we had and grew, you know, in uniform, you know, is gone, you know, but, and the other side of, you know, we're uniquely qualified and able to take this conversation forward is because, you know, we understand being a cohesive unit. We understand serving with people that are different from us. And, you know, and I believe that that gives us a leg up on society in general.
I think so. I think you bring up a really good point. We do have that responsibility. I got a note from one of my fellow Army brethren. It looks like it's just to me, but the importance of having that conversation and not necessarily being afraid of what to, you know, what to say or what to ask, but being brave enough to say it and then admit and receive the feedback that, hey, that wasn't the right way to say that, right? You're not being politically correct, or you're not saying it in a way that is helpful. It's maybe harmful, right? And be able to say it and hear that feedback and then change ourselves. Michael, how about yourself? What have you seen in the military community that allows us to do this well?
I can speak as somebody who hasn't served. I, and a great deal of people who have not, when I see somebody who's served, I stand a little straighter, and I look for, I want the veteran community to lead. You guys, there's a sense of that I trust that you guys have been through things that I haven't been through, and I think the veteran community and the military absolutely can play a lead role in the conversations that happen after George Floyd, the progress we make after the protests or during the protests. I mean, I think you guys have, folks who've been through some things that the rest of us haven't, have a perspective on things that we don't. So I'd love to see more conversations come out of this. You guys absolutely, I mean, the military is absolutely built. I interviewed Hugh McCall one time at the Bank of America executive, and he was in the Marines, and he gave me the quote about how, you know, we all put on our jeans the same way and stuff like that. And I think there's truth to that, but there's also importance now to recognize that when you leave the military, you don't put on your jeans the same way. You come back to Charlotte. Charlotte has more of an influence on your lives as veterans than I think your military service does when you live here in Charlotte, especially when it comes to matters of race and justice. Because we have the history of systemic racism in Charlotte, because we have the wedge and the crescent and all of the things that you have here, you're a member of this community, and I think it certainly shows that we do not all put on our jeans the same way when we come back to Charlotte. So so I think the perspective you bring to these conversations is really important. So, you know, when Glenn talks, I straighten up. You know, there's a little bit of that to it, and I feel the same about all of you. So thanks for what you do. There's been some great comments over here and questions too.
Yeah, no, thanks, Michael, for sharing that. I want to see Hugh McCall in jeans. I don't know if I believe it.
I know. I've never seen him in jeans either.
Yeah, a Marine banker. He doesn't. I don't. But I believe that sentiment is right. Well, and I think the point that I like Dana's point earlier in the comments about, you know, we've given ourselves a pass, right, with the racism in the military, and because we could just say, well, I don't see color. We're all green suiters. Not really. And to your points, both, this community is different, and we're better to see it, right? One of the questions we won't have time for, unfortunately, is the unique geographic position we have of being in the South and being able to live and see history here, where it's not just in a book, right? I think was another important point. I want to be mindful of time. It's 12:59. We did have at least one question from Glenn earlier. Randy, I'll let you pass that up about his experience in writing poetry. But is there anything else from Mike and Glenn that you guys think we haven't, there's a lot we haven't touched on, but just think about that, and I'll toss it back to Randy for that one question.
Michael, go ahead.
There's just a lot. I mean, there's been some ways to get involved. I saw RMJJ. I saw a link to that in there. If you want to use that, I try to think of things that are practical. There are great groups that you can be a part of if you want to have conversations about race and culture. There are practically, if you want to know a little bit about the history, there's a great new book out called Wilmington's Lie that came out in January, and it explains an event that happened in 1898 in Wilmington, and when a group of armed white folks basically overtook Wilmington when Wilmington was majority black city, had majority black leadership, things like that. And it was a coordinated white supremacy campaign in 1898. That was, part of the book that helps me understand things is, like, as a media person, I think our media is very fractured now. Well, gosh, if you go back and read newspapers in 1898, you'll notice a lot of things that are very disturbing, including how the newspapers perpetuated the white supremacy campaign, the biggest newspapers in the state. So, that's a resource I think is good. Otherwise, I just think it's time to seize this moment and understand your own biases and try to, if I can speak as to the white folks in the group, like, not only acknowledge your own biases, but also be willing to give up some of what you have for the betterment of everybody. And I think that's where we have to go with this now. So thank you.
No, that's good. Thank you. I would just add quickly, kind of co-signing on that, all of us need to be uncomfortable. You know, all of us need to be uncomfortable. And, you know, Mike, you know, addressed, you know, some of the white folks on the call, but white folks and black folks, we both have, and Hispanics, Asians across the board, LGBTQs, we have to be uncomfortable in having these conversations, because that's going to get us further down the road, you know, by doing so, you know, and, you know, that's it.
Well, I appreciate that. I think that's a fantastic point to end on. There were some great questions in the chat. We'll share that with both Michael and Glenn. We encourage you to check out their LinkedIn and Facebook groups, or excuse me, their websites, just to engage with them about, you know, Glenn, how your poetry has influenced your perspective. You know, I think there's been some great feedback that you guys gave to the question around being proactive, you know, against racial injustice rather than reactive. And some other great suggestions here. I apologize, we didn't have time for it. I do want to be respectful of everybody's time. But thank you, Glenn and Michael, for sharing. We want to continue this conversation at Veterans Bridge Home. We can tell that our veteran community wants to as well. But I think for me, the three takeaways are: we need to ask the question, but we need to listen, most importantly, right? Be uncomfortable. And who better to lean into something hard and to find common ground than our veterans? We come from every background, race, religion, and creed. We're not afraid of hard stuff, and we've been built to lead. So I challenge the rest of the community, our audience, to help us do that, right? This isn't about Veterans Bridge Home. This is about our community and each other. And I really hope we can do this together. So Glenn, Michael, thank you both very much. And to everybody else on the call, thank you for joining us. It's great to see everybody. If there's any more questions, if you have suggestions for the upcoming events and the way to continue this conversation, please don't be shy and let us know. Thanks to everybody for joining us, and have a great rest of your week. We'll talk.
Thank you.